We do concentrate a lot on Michigan stuff, but we do like to cover some more national and broader perspective and history and all that kind of stuff. And of course, with that, and I'm happy to meet somewhat personally, virtually, Vivian McPeak. How are you doing? And let me put we just got this. We're just using this new stuff here. There you go. Doesn't get much fancier than that, and that's just the most recent credit that you have, and we'll talk about a list of stuff. But thanks for joining us, Hemp Fest in Seattle. Of course, just COVID, like a lot of stuff, kind of compromised by that, but it has a rich history and tradition. And when we were talking about Hash Bash recently, which takes place first Saturday in April at high noon this last month. We talked about some of the other events, major events around the country that have a lot of importance and tradition and things like that. And Hempfest is certainly one of them. So we're interested in that a little bit, but also the journey leading up to your joining Skunk Magazine recently, and any other kind of effort or perspective that you'd like to discuss with us. I'm just really happy to be able to meet you right now and being such a big part of the history of our movement nationally. Welcome.
Vivian, you're on mute, my friend.
Oh, so the mic isn't maybe connected because this is a different service. Sometimes you have to make the extra step in settings.
Oh yeah, I had to do it. I didn't realize we were being closed captioned. That's pretty neat. Still can't hear you.
There's a settings thing with your mic that probably has to be hit.
Oh, okay, I see it.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
Sorry, I thought you had me muted. I've done so many Zoom experiences lately.
This is new for us. That's why we've got the trying out some of these bells and whistles on here.
StreamYard, yeah.
Yeah, glad to have you with us in one of our early attempts at this, but it's working out pretty good so far. Welcome.
Thank you.
Officially, Vivian McPeak, and all those things I said. I know there's a lot more, and hopefully we'll cover some of that.
Well, thank you, Jamie. It's great to be here with our esteemed colleagues. This is the 30th year that Hemp Fest is around. It's been a crazy journey to justice. As you mentioned, the pandemic has had a really huge impact on public events all over the world, really, and certainly hit us like a ton of bricks in 2020. So we have a board meeting actually tonight to further assess what is possible under the conditions here in Washington State for this year. We'll certainly be doing something. I'm personally extremely skeptical that we're going to have our usual 100,000 people down in the park in August like we normally do. As we all know, cannabis events are a little bit unique from other public events because no matter what you do, there's going to be a bunch of people sharing from their mouths with each other probably. Mm-hmm. Not to mention the fact that our state right now, our city of Seattle, is not processing special event applications for events as large as Hemp Fest. So it's very hard to plan when you don't really know what the landscape's going to be a few months down the road. But we'll be doing something. We did a pretty cool global live stream event last October. We had bands from 4 different countries and panel discussions and stuff like that. I'm not sure that we'll necessarily be doing a live stream in August either, but we're kind of batting around various ideas for ways that we can still get our message out and have an impact and create something fun and exciting for our group to do to keep everybody engaged.
I'm sure that for an event of 100,000 people, that you have to plan that months and months in advance in order to coordinate everything from security and
God.
vendors, food.
I was surprised
So
to hear that number. Yeah, that's
it's
awesome.
not really something you can do on the fly. Planning in advance is really difficult. So,
Yeah, you know,
what an extra conundrum.
We literally spend all year planning Hemp Fest, and you know, usually there's maybe 6 to 10 meetings with the Seattle Special Event Committee, which is a huge room with a gigantic square table with like 20 different city departments, and we have meetings throughout the year. Every department has to sign off on every nanoparticle of your plans, and there's about, I don't know, maybe 12 separate plans that we have to submit, you know, a security plan and a parking plan and a traffic plan and a first aid plan and a bicycle plan for where we are, because we have bicycles going through the park. On the 10 days that we're on site to produce Hemp Fest, we're on site 24 hours a day for 10 days. Then of course, you know, we have to raise about $750,000 to throw the event. And that's months and months of selling vendor placements and sponsorships and stuff like that. We have to fill 700 volunteer staff shirts on 110 crews for Hemp Fest. And so you have to do all that and all the training and everything. It's a really complex undertaking and a lot of responsibility. If you have 100,000 people, somebody could die if you did something wrong or you weren't on top of it. And we have our own trained safety patrol, our own volunteer safety patrol, our security with about 100 people with shirts and radios and all that stuff. And so there's a lot of training involved. It's just a really complex operation. And you're absolutely right. It takes, we literally, as soon as Hempfest is over, and then of course it takes, you know, a while to put it all to bed. But we immediately start working on the next year. So it is something that you can't just throw together in a couple months. It's not doable. And that's even, you know, if you're going to get a permit from the authorities to present the event. But you know, it's been devastating for public events all across the world. And we're just trying to hang in there. And, you know, being shut down halfway through the year last year was really difficult for us. And so we also have to use the limited resources we have right now very wisely and selectively, because we're kind of hanging on by a thread like a lot of folks are.
Yeah. And you mentioned 100,000 people takes a whole year to do. 30 years in the running, it must have been very difficult to convince City Council 30 years ago to allow a hemp fest. Talk about that.
Well, you know, I'm not sure that Seattle Hemp Fest would exist if we weren't in a progressive, you know, city like Seattle that has such a rich history going all the way back to the Wobblies of dissent and protest and stuff. But you know, we initially kind of came in under the radar for the first couple of years because the person that was processing just a regular parks event permit in those days in the very beginning, because we started off small, he was a deadhead, you know, who we kind of knew from the Blue Moon, which is this historic 70-year, or now it's, 90-year-old tavern in Seattle, which is kind of the Grateful Dead headquarters of the Pacific Northwest. And so he kind of slid us under the radar until 94, when we had about 15,000 people at Gasworks Park. And then we came under the spotlight of the Special Events Committee. And that was very intimidating and intense. And we did, for the first time, hit some pushback. And that's when, you know, we were going to have to get porta potties and radios and security and fencing and things like that that we'd never had to deal with before. But it's been an amazing process, and we have had to fight for our permit multiple times. We've probably had to file lawsuits a couple times against the city to get our permit, and we've won. These days, you know, it's not as contentious of a relationship, but it's still extremely complex and demanding. You know, the city officials that sign off are very serious about their jobs. They're very serious about public safety. And if you have 100,000 people, you know, there's a real potential that something could go south. And you got to have your ducks in a row. You have to know what you're doing, and your plans have to be solid. And at this point, you know, we've got to a point now where we're so established Our best, the crazy kind of counterintuitive thing is right now when we go into these big permit meetings with the special events committee, the police are kind of our biggest supporters, and they've stood up for us several times in the last couple of years and defended us against accusations coming from usually the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, which is this entity that created by Initiative 502, which oversees cannabis on Washington State. And believe it or not, the police department has defended us quite a bit because they work with us on site, full time, and they've got a compound. They don't come into the event much anymore. They stay outside of the event, right outside our perimeter with a little camp, and they have one of our security radios, and they're monitoring our security channel. And if we need them, they come in. But they have worked with us so intimately that they've actually, we've become friends with a lot of them. Which is almost embarrassing in this BLM period, but it's still very dicey, and you still have to work very hard for that permit. And you probably should.
Yeah, that's the behavior of the police not caring as much anymore about being in the middle of the event and all that kind of stuff. And with 100,000 people is pretty impressive. I know that at Hash Bash, that's been the case over the last few years. And Adam Brook, Mr. Hash Bash himself, is watching.
Well, a few times, Jamie, we've actually had to tell the police, look, man, would you please ride through our event? Would you show up and make a presence a couple times? Because, there's a lot of people in here, and we could actually use just your appearance would not be that bad, because 100,000 people is a lot of people. And if you've got 100,000 people, statistically, you've got some bad actors, you've got a little bit of everything in there.
Sure.
But our safety patrol does a great job. And, we don't allow sales at the event because it's not Felony Fest. And that's kind of a handshake agreement that we have with the city, is that if, we're not going to allow sales, but everybody's going to be smoking, everybody. And essentially it's like prohibition doesn't exist. And it's a 1.3 mile expanse of public park. It's 3 public parks joined together consecutively. And basically everybody is, we put a chimney to shame at Hempfest. We like to say we've incinerated more marijuana than the DEA at Hempfest.
That's great. I was surprised to hear. I mean, I know it was big, but that's quite a gathering, and to happen regularly like that is really impressive. And I know that you need the police to focus in on public health and safety issues at large, especially with the gathering that big. But the idea that there's not this overriding concern of wanting to, be concerned about just adults with a bunch of cannabis gathering together for a good time is kind of a good sign of the times.
Yeah, in 30 years, we've never had a serious accident, injury, or arrest at Hempfest. And so I think that the stats speak for themselves, that if it was Alcohol Fest, for example, it'd be a completely different story.
Yeah, no question about that. So Washington State's come a long way, right in the beginning, starting off with legalization, kind of adopted the tier system type of thing, which was prohibitive and really getting something up and moving or whatever. But things have gone for a while now in that regard. In Michigan, we kind of like some of the stuff that's going on here, but we always say we still have a lot of work to do. How do you assess the current state of things in your own state?
Well, to be honest, we're very dissatisfied. Well, those of us in the cannabis reform community, and especially the medical marijuana community, are very dissatisfied with the status quo here in Washington State. One of the downsides of being first is that you're kind of locked in with what you have, and if you're first, you make you make sacrifices to get it passed that you might not have to make down the road. We are one of the only retail legal states that doesn't have citizen home grow for non-medical marijuana patients, which is really crazy. I really connect with what Brandy said about contaminants, because we don't have mandatory testing for heavy metals or pesticides or fungicides in Washington State. And that's a really important issue that we're very concerned about. I'll be honest with you. I voted against I-502. Most of my friends, most of my colleagues voted against our state initiative because, for one, it didn't have home grow, but also it has this 5 nanogram per se DUI component to it, which, if you've got 5 nanograms of metabolites for THC in your blood system, then you're guilty of a DUI, and they don't even have to prove that you were impaired. And that's insane.
That's
and
the case for Colorado, what you just described.
Yeah, we traded a possession charge for a DUI charge, and DUI is a much more serious crime than possession of an ounce of weed. There were several aspects of it that we thought we could do better, frankly. But it was, and we'll be honest with you, it was absolutely the most painful vote I've ever made in my entire life, and I was extremely conflicted. And I was demonized by half the cannabis community for that. But I was also celebrated when it passed, which shows you how crazy and how complicated it is, because I realized that it was such a huge thing. It was so important to break the ice. But there's still an incredible amount of work to do here and nationally as well. As we all know, there's 40,000 Americans right now in jails and prisons, and a couple dozen people serving life in prison for cannabis. But it sure is exciting that how the paradigm is shifting so fast, how we've had multiple states flip just in the last several months, and not by citizens' initiative, but by legislatures or governors taking the initiative. And the really exciting thing, I think, is that they're starting to just proactively build in social equity components, inadequate usually components, but wow, that's a precedent that we haven't had that is just so important. But it is, what we have to do, obviously, as was spoken earlier, is we have to completely remove cannabis from the federal schedule so that we can have, something more than commoditization, which is what I consider what we have here in Washington State. Commercialization, which is good, but not enough.
Right. Has there ever been, because of the medical laws and then the adult use laws, has there been much discussion? Does Washington State have its own controlled substances list? Does cannabis remain on it and as a Schedule 1 or something that is associated with criminal penalties that gets? That's
an interesting question. What I do know is that we just had our drug possession law invalidated by a court challenge. And all drugs for the last maybe 4 or 5 months have been legal to possess in Washington State for the first time. And our legislature just changed that just recently, making all drug possession a misdemeanor offense, a misdemeanor crime. But I don't believe that cannabis is on our state's controlled substances list at this point, which would be ironic if it was, because the state really took over the black market. The state is involved in selling cannabis right now since it's federally illegal.
Be interesting. A lot of people are surprised when they hear that that's the case in Michigan, in spite of all the other law changes that have taken place since 1978, when that particular act was the presiding law. So we've been in conflict with it for a long time, but it hasn't been resolved.
Another thing I'll point out that I think is notable is that it seems like cannabis has transcended partisan politics finally, and it's not really a partisan issue that you hear much about. I know what I mean by that is that the Republicans don't seem to be aggressively, they might be blocking legislation, but not aggressively bringing it up as an issue and presenting, laws. It seems like I feel like we're reaching close to a critical mass to end this critical mess of prohibition.
Yes, and I think so. That's what the point is. Like, we've come so far, but we still have that that work to do, and there's still a ways to go before things are where we're going to be satisfied. And I understand why you did not vote for that law. In Ohio, there was the oligopoly attempt that was blatant. The people of Ohio want legalization, but they didn't want that because we
The
can
responsible Ohio movement, yeah.
They tried that stuff in Michigan too, and we said, no, we can do better than that. And the whole argument's always, the incremental change. The ability for somebody who's an adult to go to a store and get cannabis, not to look over their shoulder. Who cares who's making the money? But there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and we care about a lot of those components.
Arizona rejected their first legalization effort too for the same reason.
And what we knew is with something like a DUI provision, what politicians are going to want to come forward to loosen up the DUI provision, right? I mean, who's going to do that? Because there's one accident happens, somebody dies, and he doesn't get elected again. So we knew that something like that, once you're stuck with it, man, it's really, really hard to change it. And, you know, getting a green DUI is a life wrecker for some people.
So in Michigan, there was a, and by the way, in the meantime, Jim Salame and John Schlicker have joined us, and we'll be in on the conversation a little bit. In Michigan, I think starting a couple of years ago, I was under the Schneider administration, and one of the then either representatives or senators, Lucido, who's now a prosecutor in Macomb County, Republican, helped to get a group and panel to determine what the limit should be for driving. And I believe it was tasked with determining what it should be. I think that was some of the initial like controversial wording.
To determine the nanogram limit was their mission.
We don't even know if we need it, you know, but they're going to determine what they're going to assume that we need it and then what the number is. But anyway, that ultimately they determine that you can't determine what number fits any given person at a given time that could then demonstrate that they are in use of cannabis or whatever
It should be a performance-based field test, an impairment-based field test of some kind.
And in order to start that investigation, the person has to be giving reason to continue that investigation, like driving over the middle line or going too fast, or those things that alert the cop that something might be needed to be looked into a little bit more. So that's the way it is here now. There was just a bill introduced though for a 5 nanogram limit. Even after that, a panel, even after all this stuff,
they really want it. They'll try anything. Well, but law enforcement wants tools. Then the thing is, it's our job as citizens to tell them which tools they're not allowed to use because they're not scientifically accurate and they cause more harm than the problem they purport to solve. And with cannabis and driving, there really is no problem for them to solve.
And I'm sure, Washington went early, but as is the case with every other state, there wasn't an uptick in issues on the road with younger people, with more users, all the sky didn't fall, all the common things that were projected, the reasons not to do anything never happened. And now it's never happened in several states. It seems like we should be moving a little faster, but I agree with you too, Vivian, that definitely momentum is in the right direction. Sometimes it seems pretty slow. Brandy's reminded me of that a couple of times. We've all experienced it too.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can get some national action happening. It's a little disappointing that Biden's position is what it is. But if you look at the polling, I just don't see how this administration cannot do some substantive reforms.
The people all around him in the legislature, Blumenauer, Cory Booker, Schumer and company believe that they can get him to lean the right way if they can set him up properly with him. So hope that they are able to achieve something reasonable.
Sometimes what presidents need is someone else to do all the work, and they can say, well, I'm going to sign it, but I really don't endorse it. And that's
Right.
really what would happen. If there were legislation to emerge from the House and Senate, voted on and approved by both houses, and it hit his desk, he would be a fool to veto it. He'd be better off to just sign it and say, this is Chuck Schumer's accomplishment, yay, Chuck. And we'd be happy with that as long as it's good legislation.
This is concerning Vivian here.
Yeah, he's got so many priorities. Let's hope that eventually that this comes up and is something that can be at the front of the list and get taken care of. But we need to ramp up the pressure because we know that's a huge part of it. And I don't know if anybody else is experiencing this, but here in our cannabis community, there's this kind of apathy of in fact, I hear pretty frequently, "Oh, Hemp Fest, you still doing that? Isn't it legal?" And I bristle at that. And I go, I'll tell you what, why don't you drive to the Idaho border, take 5 steps across the border and light up a joint and tell me how legal cannabis feels Or tell me how legal it feels to all the people in jails and prisons, or the people that have a car behind them right now having their kids taken away. So, there's kind of a sense of well, we've achieved it. We can kick back, and because I can go get an ounce of pot from a rec store and drive away without having to look in my rearview mirror. So we're just finding that there's certainly not the funding available for reform efforts anymore. Everybody wants to get involved in the industry now, and that's where all the money's going, which we're finding to be pretty disturbing. But there's also just kind of an apathy as far as just getting energy up and getting people to come forward to take place because it feels so tolerant locally. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that.
Oh, lag in advocacy? Yes, we here in Michigan hear all the time. It's legal. Why do you want me to join Americans for Safe Access? Why do you want me to join Normal of Michigan? Mission accomplished, right? And then we have to break their heart by saying no.
Yeah.
So let's
it's a great problem to have. Great problem to have. Sorry.
Right on. We have reduced a lot of action and enforcement toward cannabis in Michigan via a lot of the new laws and stuff, but we still deal with a lot of those issues that you just talked about, even and now. So there's a lot of work to do, and we would definitely get a lot of help if we had a lot of angles on this, including the some national direction.
Well, yeah, it's still a felony to have over an ounce of pot here in Washington State, and that's not satisfactory, if you ask me.
It's not. Still a felony for possession, for mere possession, no transfer. That's wrong. Well, Vivian, I often say the states are all crucibles of democracy. Each one can concoct their own individual legalization program. And then the beauty of America is that we can select the pieces of those programs that work best and then work them into our system. And then in that way, refine our program by letting someone else be the proof statement for it.
Yeah. Yep. That's the beauty of the way that this representative democracy has been put together.
As long as the federal government stays out of state politics, then we'd be fine. If the federal government decides to homogenize all of the state programs, as we know the federal government likes to do, that would be quite a difficulty for most states.
Yeah. We still have people losing their homes here for overcultivation in this state, even in this county, even in this liberal King County here. So, there's just still a lot of real heavy lifting to be done. But it's amazing how far we've come so fast. I say so fast. I mean, since 2012. It's been a long journey
to get there.
Yeah.
Hey, so we have a couple minutes. If you have the time, let's talk about your new venture with Skunk Magazine and how that came together and why that's a good fit for you and so forth. What's going on with that?
Yeah, we're actually in the absolute throes of our seasonal deadline right now, and I had to stop editing to come and do this. But I'm real excited to align myself with Skunk. My values line up with Skunk's values very well. The magazine's dedicated to organic, regenerative, sustainable cultivation, and Gaia principles, which really strike a chord in me. And as I mentioned on social media that you might have seen, Skunk Magazine recognizes there's a whole entire new guard. There's a whole new generational wave of cannabis enthusiasts and lifestyle. But the magazine also still pays homage to the countercultural pioneers who paved the way for this reality today. And it's just a great team of people, and I'm really excited to be able to contribute. I also, will plug that I have a podcast as well called 10% on Cannabis Radio. I've done about 200 interviews. Not really competition because it's one big cannabis media community. Hopefully,
we love other shows, man. It's not a competition to us.
This group is composed of people who do their own other shows too. Shelley does Reads and Weeds, and we have the NTO show with Jim and Colin.
Two of the guys leading the effort on getting entheogenic plants legalized and decriminalized here in Michigan are part of the show, and they have their own show called the NTO Show.
Yeah. Could you repeat that information about how to find your podcast, though, Vivian, because it was sort of lost.
Well, you could just do a Google search of hemp present. It's like represent, but it's hemp present. Or you could go to cannabisradio.com and then slide, click through all the things and click mine. But the easiest way is just to Google hemp present, and my thing will come up. And it's really great. It's great that we have taken our own control of the alternative media and the digital media and getting our messaging out. It's a great change from the way things used to be. It used to be so hard to crack the mainstream media barrier, the kind of iron curtain in the old days. You basically had to have a disaster happen or a bust or something like that to get media in the old days. So it's really cool that we've been able to kind of exploit the digital world and get our own messaging out regionally and nationally and internationally.
What are the dates of Hempfest?
We don't have dates right now. We're not positive that the event's going to be happening this year due to the COVID restrictions in our state. It's very, very difficult to plan right now under these conditions of changing. I mean, we're on the verge of probably going back into phase 2 in a couple weeks because the numbers have been slipping a little bit up. This was the epicenter. This was the kind of ground zero here in Seattle of COVID coming to America. And with 100,000 people, we're pretty confident there's no way on earth that they're going to let 100,000 people meet all in one spot anytime this year. And for the events that do happen right now, the much smaller number that have been just recently allowed, there's a tremendous amount of COVID-related restrictions that you have to put in. Everybody has to be 6 feet apart and things like that we look at those and they seem almost impossible to enforce with 100,000 people in a confined area like Seattle Hemp Fest. So I'm frustrated to say that I'm not convinced that the event will happen in its traditional fashion this year. And we're looking at alternative projects and events that we might be able to pull off.
What are the dates normally?
Well, normally be the third weekend of August.
Gotcha.
Oh, so there's Canada stuff.
And what got it started? I mean, in a nutshell, I know that we're kind of toward the end here, but like, what was the thing that kicked that off?
Seattle Hemp Fest?
Yes.
Well, we had this thing going on, which still goes on since the early 80s, called the Seattle Peace Concerts. And that's a concert series of free shows that would happen in various parks throughout the summer in Seattle that would move from park to park. And I was on the board of the Peace Concerts back in 1990. And the Persian Gulf War was starting. The first President Bush and the first Iraq War, the invasion of Kuwait was coalescing. And we had a peace concert down at Gasworks Park in Seattle, a former oil refinery. So it was very apropos. And the short story is this idea kind of circulated that we should stay in the park and have a peace vigil, a peace camp, a protest, occupy the park and demand that America gets out of Kuwait. And so 100 people spent the night that night under this huge double-ended Bedouin rainbow tent from the Rainbow Gathering that somebody brought down and erected illegally in the park. And the next day, the Parks Department came down and threatened to rip the tent down. And so we all moved under this huge, gigantic covered structure that was the former gas facility works that had picnic tables and sinks and fire pits in it and stuff. And so we had about 100 people in there. We were there for 6 months, actually, with this peace camp, this occupation of the park. They couldn't get rid of us. And we had big rallies and big teach-ins and stuff. And somebody organized a startup meeting for a Washington State chapter of NORML at what we called Peaceworks Park. We renamed it for our vigil. And about 40 of us showed up for this meeting. But the guy that was promoting it never showed up. He was a no-show. And it was really kind of anticlimactic. And so my colleague, Gary Cook, said, we should do something. We have to do something. Let's hold a hemp fest. And everybody's like, a hemp fest? What's that? And that's kind of how the idea was born. And the first one was at Volunteer Park in 1991. We had about 500 people, and I was the MC. And I remember going, man, it was huge. There was 500 people, and we were so excited. And we thought that was a massive turnout. And the very beginning, we got to the park about 7 a.m. to put up the PA. There's a little amphitheater already there. And we were very concerned by all the homeless people that were sleeping in the park. There was just so many of them. And as people woke up, we found out they weren't homeless at all. They had come from other communities, and even some people came from another state. And that's when we kind of realized, wow, there's a real need. There's a lot of support for something like this. And of course, Jack Harrer, we brought Jack up the very first year, and he spoke at every Seattle Hemp Fest until he died, except the year that he had his stroke in 2010.
Very cool, man. I mean,
That is awesome.
I didn't know any of that, and I feel enlightened. I really appreciate that encapsulation. I'm glad we got to that before it was all over. And I would love to make it out to one of those, man. That sounds like a blast.
Yeah, me too.
We're trying to hang in here, man. It's been rough. The last year and a half has economically been devastating for us. And we just lost our store and offices. We had a hemp boutique and offices in Lake City here outside of Seattle. And we lost that about 3 months ago. It was closed for 6 months due to COVID restrictions. It's been tough, but it's not just us. It's tough on everybody.
Well,
So-
certainly, go ahead, Jimmy.
No, go ahead, Rick.
I
Sorry.
was just going to say best wishes for the fest. Certainly, there are very few things in America that have been positive examples of cannabis use that really showcase the users of cannabis, not the businesses of cannabis. I can think of, the Boston Freedom Rally, obviously Hash Bash, Seattle Hemp Fest, in Wisconsin. There's a big thing in Madison. And that's about it. There's very few. So thanks so much for all your decades of work making sure that people had a positive image of cannabis in America.
Thank you. And I know time's running out. I just want to add that a lot of people say, well, is Hempfest even necessary anymore? Because isn't it going to be legal? And we think that there's Oktoberfest in Germany where 1 million people celebrate beer culture, and beer's never been illegal. So we think that events like Hempfest should happen as cultural celebrations long after legalization.
Perfect.
Amen.
I love it.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to make sure you leave us with or direct people to?
Not really. What I just really like to say is that this is so great to belong to this beautiful cannabis community. I was mentioned earlier, this global cannabis community. I've been to Europe, I've been to Mexico, I've been to Canada, and I was at that first time I went to the Cannabis Cup in '95. I was in this room with about 6 or 8 people, and we're all passing a joint around. It took 15 or 20 minutes before we realized that nobody spoke the same language, because the cannabis community is basically the same everywhere I've gone. And it's just always beautiful, mostly beautiful, sweet, gentle, artistic, spiritual people. And it's just, a blessing of my life is having the honor and the experience of belonging to this global community.
Very nice.
Very nice. Hey, well, thanks a lot. We know you got some editing to do, and appreciate you taking the time out to hang out with us. And I definitely want to check in again down the road. And again, hey, one time before we go, where can people check out your podcast?
Oh, it's just do a search for Hempresent, HEMPRESENT. It's like hemp and resent, but we don't resent the hemp. Or they can go to cannabisradio.com and click on it there.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, man. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it. And good luck with everything moving forward.